In the quiet solitude of a modest home, 78-year-old Mrs. Jane Hill's life was about to take a dramatic turn, one that no one could have predicted. A routine visit from her weekly nurse revealed something that would set off a chain of events leading to a medical crisis that no one saw coming. For years, Mrs. Hill had lived a relatively independent life, despite the growing challenges that age and chronic health conditions often bring. Living alone in her small, quiet home, she had adapted to the rhythms of solitude. Meals on Wheels arrived each day, and a visiting nurse helped her manage her diabetes and hypertension. It wasn't an ideal existence, but it was manageable, until the day when everything seemed to unravel. It was a seemingly ordinary morning when Mrs. Hill began experiencing strange symptoms. What seemed like a typical case of urinary frequency soon escalated. Along with the frequent trips to the bathroom, she developed a sharp abdominal pain that left her feeling weak and disoriented. Her normally sharp mind seemed to cloud over with confusion, an unsettling change that both alarmed her and those around her. Was this just another health issue to manage, or was it something far more serious? Mrs. Hill's medical history was far from simple. She had lived with hypertension and type 2 diabetes for many years. These chronic conditions had required constant monitoring and management. Her blood sugar levels fluctuated, sometimes leaving her feeling fatigued and unwell. Her hypertension was controlled with medication, but she still faced occasional bouts of dizziness and lightheadedness. On top of this, Mrs. Hill had chronic venous insufficiency, a condition that made her legs swell and cause discomfort, further limiting her mobility. Despite these challenges, Mrs. Hill was determined to maintain her independence. She did her best to manage her health, taking her medications as prescribed and attending regular checkups with her healthcare provider. But the recent changes in her health, specifically the confusion that came on suddenly, raised more serious concerns. First, Mrs. Hill's confusion was subtle. She found herself forgetting where she had placed items, becoming disoriented in the house she had lived in for years. But the confusion worsened over the course of several days. She began forgetting conversations, repeating questions she had just asked, and struggling to recognize familiar faces, including her nurse and the delivery person for her Meals on Wheels. Her caregivers were understandably worried, and her family, though distant, began to take notice of the changes. It was during one of her weekly nurse visits that the true extent of Mrs. Hill's decline became apparent. The nurse, who had been visiting for months, immediately noted the marked change in her cognitive function. Mrs. Hill seemed agitated and confused, her words slurred and her thoughts disjointed. She was unable to recall details of her routine, like when she last ate or when she had taken her medication. The nurse's immediate concern was that this sudden cognitive shift could be a sign of a serious medical condition, possibly a urinary tract infection, UTI, dehydration, or something far more sinister. Upon further investigation, the nurse also noted that Mrs. Hill's vital signs were slightly off. Her blood pressure was low, likely due to dehydration, and her heart rate was elevated. Her blood sugar levels were checked, revealing that they were higher than usual, which could indicate poor diabetic control. This, combined with her confusion and abdominal pain, painted a picture of a woman in distress. Her nurse suspected that a UTI might be the culprit, as urinary frequency and discomfort were common symptoms of such infections, particularly in elderly women. However, the nurse also knew that confusion in older adults could be linked to other causes, including metabolic disturbances, dehydration, or even a stroke. The nurse's instinct was to take action immediately. Mrs. Hill was referred to the emergency department for further evaluation. Upon her arrival at the hospital, a more comprehensive assessment began. Doctors performed a thorough physical examination, focusing on her abdominal pain and cognitive confusion. Laboratory tests were ordered to rule out infections or metabolic imbalances. An ultrasound was done to examine her abdomen, and a full blood panel was taken to assess her kidney function, electrolytes, and blood glucose levels. As Mrs. Hill underwent these tests, her family members, though distant, were contacted. They arrived at the hospital, unsure of what to expect. What had happened to the woman who had been so independent for so many years? Why had she deteriorated so rapidly? What was the cause of her confusion and pain? The results were initially inconclusive. While Mrs. Hill did have a urinary tract infection, the doctors were concerned that the confusion might be linked to something more complex. Was it simply the result of a UTI, Or was it a deeper, more systemic issue? Could her diabetes have contributed to her mental state? Was there another undiagnosed condition affecting her cognitive function? These questions loomed over her care team as they continued to run tests and monitor her closely. As the hours passed, Mrs. Hill's confusion continued. She became more agitated and began expressing anxiety about her situation. She kept asking why she was in the hospital and repeatedly questioned the nurses and doctors about her condition. The healthcare team found it difficult to gain clear answers from her, as her cognitive responses were increasingly muddled. Despite her condition, Mrs. Hill was still aware enough to express her concern for her health, but the lack of clarity in her responses made it difficult for the medical team to pinpoint the exact cause of her confusion. The team's concerns grew. Was this simply the result of a urinary infection or dehydration, or was there a deeper issue at play? Could this be a sign of early-onset dementia or another neurodegenerative condition? Mrs. Hill's history of chronic conditions made the case even more complex, as her diabetes, hypertension, and venous insufficiency could all contribute to cognitive decline. For Mrs. Hill's family, the situation was a cruel wake-up call. They had always known that she had health challenges, but they never expected her to suddenly slip into such an alarming state. Her children, who lived far away, felt helpless as they tried to make sense of her condition over the phone. Should they come to the hospital? Should they bring her home for further care? The uncertainty about her health left them with more questions than answers. The doctors were determined to get to the bottom of Mrs. Hill's condition. Her care team continued to run tests and provide her with supportive treatments, including intravenous fluids to address potential dehydration. They also prescribed antibiotics to address the UTI. But the uncertainty about the root cause of her confusion left everyone on edge. As the first day at the hospital ended, Mrs. Hill's family faced an unsettling reality. Their mother and grandmother was not the same woman they had known. The confusion and physical distress she had experienced marked the beginning of a long road ahead, one that would require careful monitoring, further medical tests, and a comprehensive care plan. Was Mrs. Hill's confusion reversible, or would this mark the beginning of a decline that she could not recover from? This story, filled with unexpected twists and profound challenges, was only just beginning. What started as a routine nurse visit had snowballed into a medical mystery, leaving Mrs. Hill's healthcare team and family struggling to understand the full scope of her condition. The next steps would be crucial in determining her future, and the path to her recovery, or, perhaps, the inevitable consequences of aging and illness. Sarah had made her decision. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without fear, but she was determined to take that leap. She'd spent too many nights staring at the ceiling, wondering what her life could be like if she simply let go of the past. This time, it wasn't about perfection. It was about courage. Courage to face her insecurities, courage to put herself out there, and most importantly, courage to trust herself again. The first thing she did was book a ticket. To anywhere. It didn't matter where. She just needed to go. She needed to break free from the routine that had stifled her creativity and dreams for so long. With each click of the mouse as she booked her flight, she felt a weight slowly lifting off her shoulders. I'm doing this. I'm really doing this. But even as she took that first step, doubt crept in. She had no plan, no destination, just a flight to an unfamiliar place with no itinerary and nothing but her own self to rely on. What if she made a mistake? What if it didn't work out? The old familiar voice of fear whispered its doubts, but she shut it down. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to turn back now. The night before her flight, Sarah couldn't sleep. She packed her suitcase in a frenzy, unsure of what to bring or what she might need. Her closet, once full of clothes that now felt like remnants of a past life, looked empty, devoid of the excitement it once brought. But that didn't matter. She only needed a few essentials, a few clothes, her phone, and a passport. Everything else could wait. As the alarm rang early the next morning, she pulled herself out of bed and took a long look at her apartment. It wasn't the dream life she had envisioned for herself, but it was a chapter that was now closing. She was ready to begin something new, something undefined but filled with the promise of possibility. The airport felt different, not just because it was bustling with people going to and from different parts of the world, but because it symbolized a boundary she was crossing. She was no longer tethered to her old life. The chaos of the terminal, the announcements over the PA system, and the rush of travelers all reminded her of the unknowns ahead. For the first time in years, she felt alive. The flight was long and uncomfortable. Her nerves buzzed with anticipation and anxiety as the plane soared above the clouds. It felt surreal. I'm actually doing this. I'm leaving everything behind. But where am I going? The question lingered in her mind as she tried to distract herself with books and movies. But deep down, she knew that the journey wasn't about finding answers on this trip. It was about finding herself. When the plane finally touched down, Sarah's heart raced. She had no plan, no clue where to go, but she stepped off the plane with a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. As the crowd moved past her, she stood there for a moment, taking it all in. This is it, she thought. This is my new beginning. Her first stop was a small cafe she had Googled before her flight. It wasn't much, just a quaint little place with mismatched chairs and cozy corners. But it felt like a good place to start. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as she sat by the window, watching the world outside. It was strange. For years, she had been caught up in the rush of life, thinking she had to constantly be moving, constantly striving to reach some goal. But here, in this moment of stillness, she realized something important. Sometimes, you have to stop. You have to be present. You have to listen to the quiet, and only then can you truly hear yourself. As she sipped her coffee, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her decision. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was terrifying. But this was her chance to rediscover what mattered most, her chance to create a life she could be proud of. And with that thought, she felt a spark of determination ignite deep within her. She wasn't going to let fear hold her back anymore. She was going to find the courage to step into the unknown, no matter how daunting it seemed. Days passed, and Sarah began to explore the city. She didn't have a specific plan, no agenda. She simply wandered, letting her feet guide her. As she strolled through the streets, she realized how much of life she had missed out on while being consumed with worry. The vibrant colors of the market stalls, the sounds of street musicians, and the laughter of people around her, all of it made her feel more connected to the world than she had felt in years. It was in one of those quiet moments, as she sat by a fountain, that Sarah met someone who would change her life. He was an older man, with kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of a life well lived. His name was Alan, and he had been traveling the world for decades, never settling in one place for too long. Alan had seen more of the world than Sarah could ever imagine, and his stories were captivating. He spoke about the places he had visited, the people he had met, and the lessons he had learned along the way. But what struck Sarah the most wasn't just his stories, it was the way he spoke about life. He didn't have any regrets. He didn't have any fears. Alan had learned that the key to happiness wasn't in chasing after the next big thing or following a set path. It was in embracing the unknown, letting go of expectations, and learning to appreciate each moment. Sarah listened intently, absorbing every word he said. It was as if the universe had sent him to remind her of something important. Life is not about controlling everything. It's about trusting the journey, even when you can't see where it's headed. As they parted ways, Alan handed her a small leather journal. For your travels, he said with a smile. Write down your thoughts. You never know when they might guide you. That night, Sarah sat in her small hotel room, the journal resting on her lap. She opened it and stared at the empty pages, her hand hovering over the pen. She didn't know where her journey would take her. She didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The city felt different the next day, almost as though it were breathing with her, every corner inviting her to discover something new. Sarah spent the morning in quiet reflection, writing in her journal as Alan had suggested. Each word felt like a small piece of her soul, her thoughts unfolding onto the pages with honesty she had not allowed herself in years. The fear she had carried for so long, the fear of failure, of not being enough, seemed to dissipate with every sentence. In that small, simple act of writing, Sarah realized that she had been the one holding herself back all this time. The pages became a mirror, reflecting her thoughts, her doubts, her desires. She wrote about her fears, but also about the dreams that had once seemed impossible, dreams she had abandoned for the comfort of routine. She wrote about how trapped she had felt in the life she had built, not realizing until now that she had the power to break free. By afternoon, she felt a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. She had come here looking for something external, something to give her direction, a purpose. But now she understood. The journey was not about finding answers in the world around her. It was about discovering what was already inside her. She could feel the change, small but significant, rippling through her. Sarah's next decision was bold. She would leave the city for a while and explore the surrounding countryside. It wasn't something she had planned, but her intuition told her it was time to slow down, to leave behind the bustling streets and let nature be her guide. The open road called to her, and she answered without hesitation. She rented a small car and headed toward the hills that stretched out beyond the city's reach. The drive was peaceful, the winding roads surrounded by lush green fields and towering trees. Sarah rolled down the windows, letting the fresh air fill her lungs, the sound of the wind in her ears. It felt like freedom, pure and unfiltered. As she drove further, she came across a small village tucked away in the hills. It looked like something out of a storybook: quaint cottages with thatched roofs, cobblestone streets lined with flowers, and locals who greeted her with warm smiles. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, and Sarah immediately felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in ages. She checked into a bed and breakfast, a charming little place run by an elderly woman named Edith. Edith was warm and welcoming, with a quick smile and stories of the village that made Sarah feel like she had found a hidden corner of the world where things still made sense. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Sarah sat in the garden with a cup of tea, listening to Edith talk about life, love, and loss. The stories were simple, yet profound, each one reminding Sarah of the beauty in the quiet moments and the connections made between strangers. That night, as Sarah lay in the small room, the sounds of the village drifting in through the window, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to be fully present, to be okay with the uncertainty of the future. She wasn't searching for anything anymore. She had realized that the search was never the point. Life wasn't about finding answers or reaching some perfect destination. It was about experiencing every moment, every feeling, and allowing yourself to grow along the way. The next few days in the village were transformative. She spent her mornings walking through the fields, her afternoons chatting with the locals, and her evenings writing in her journal. The simplicity of life in the village made her feel connected to herself in a way she hadn't imagined possible. Every day was an adventure, but not in the traditional sense. There were no grand gestures or life-changing events, just moments of quiet joy that filled her heart with gratitude. On her last day in the village, Sarah decided to hike up to a hilltop that Edith had mentioned. From there, she would be able to see the entire valley, the village nestled like a secret in the hills below. The hike was challenging, but the higher she climbed, the clearer her mind became. She found herself thinking less about the past and more about the present, about how far she had come, not just physically, but emotionally. The weight of her past mistakes and regrets seemed lighter now, as if the higher she climbed, the further away they became. When Sarah reached the top of the hill, she stopped to catch her breath. The view before her was breathtaking: vast stretches of green fields, rivers winding through the valley, and the distant mountains standing tall against the sky. It was the kind of view that made you feel small, yet powerful, like a part of something much bigger than yourself. She stood there for a long time, taking it all in, allowing herself to simply exist in the moment. There was no urgency, no need to rush. This was her moment to be still, to appreciate everything she had learned on this journey. She had let go of the need for control, the need to have everything figured out. And in doing so, she had found peace. As she descended the hill and made her way back to the village, Sarah felt a sense of fulfillment. She had come here searching for something, but she was leaving with so much more than she had expected. She had discovered that the answers she sought weren't out there in the world. They had been inside her all along. On her way back to the city, Sarah stopped at a small shop and bought a painting from a local artist, a landscape of the hills she had just visited. It was simple, yet beautiful, and as she looked at it, she knew it would serve as a reminder of her journey. Not just the physical journey, but the emotional and spiritual one as well. The journey that had taught her to let go of fear, to embrace uncertainty, and to trust that everything would fall into place as it was meant to. Back in the city, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't have all the answers, but she was no longer afraid of not knowing. Life, she realized, was never meant to be figured out. It was meant to be lived. And she was finally ready to live it, fully and without reservation. Sarah's return to the city was different this time. The streets that once felt crowded and suffocating now appeared more like a canvas of endless possibility. She had spent the past few days feeling disconnected, unsure of what her next step would be, but something had shifted in her during her time away. The clarity she had found in the hills, the freedom she felt in that village, and the peace that had embraced her now seemed like her true calling. She was ready to take on whatever came next, no longer weighed down by her past fears and self-imposed limitations. The first step was simple but significant. Sarah decided to let go of the job that had kept her tethered to a life she no longer recognized as her own. She had been an advertising executive, working long hours in a high-pressure environment that drained her spirit. Though the paycheck was reliable and the career path seemed stable, it no longer brought her fulfillment. She had been clinging to it out of habit, not realizing that her soul had been quietly dying under the fluorescent lights of the office. After much contemplation, Sarah made the decision to resign. She didn't have another job lined up, but for the first time in years, the uncertainty felt like an opportunity rather than a threat. Her heart raced as she typed up her resignation letter, but as she pressed send, a wave of relief washed over her. It was a small victory, one that gave her the courage to embrace the unknown. With the weight of her old career lifted, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. What was she meant to do next? She had no concrete plans, no roadmap to follow. But deep down, she knew that the journey she had started in the hills was far from over. The question was not what she should do, but rather, who she was becoming. For the next few weeks, Sarah took time to explore the different possibilities that lay before her. She visited various art galleries, reflecting on the beauty of the pieces, wondering if art was a path she could follow. She enrolled in photography classes, eager to capture the world through a different lens. She spent hours in bookstores, browsing through books on personal development, nature, and travel. Each experience felt like a brushstroke on a canvas, each decision a small step forward in discovering who she truly was. One morning, as Sarah sat in a quaint cafe with a cup of coffee and a book in hand, she noticed something strange. The old Sarah, the one who had been lost and uncertain, seemed to be fading into the background. In her place was someone new, someone who felt lighter, more confident, and yet more curious than ever. She wasn't afraid to ask herself the hard questions anymore. What did she want from life? What did she want to contribute to the world? These were questions she had never dared to ask herself before. Over time, Sarah's days became less about planning and more about feeling. She allowed herself to be spontaneous, to explore different paths without worrying about the outcome. There was an exhilarating freedom in not knowing what the future held. She had let go of her need for control, understanding that the best things in life often happen when you stop trying to force them. Then, one evening, Sarah received a call that would mark the beginning of her next chapter. It was from Alan, the man whose words had started this journey, whose mentorship had helped her reconnect with herself. He had been following her progress from afar, and he invited her to speak at a workshop he was organizing for people seeking personal transformation. At first, Sarah hesitated. Public speaking had always been a fear of hers, one of the many walls she had built around herself. But something inside her shifted. She realized that this was exactly the kind of opportunity she needed to face her fears head-on. It was time to put her growth to the test, to share her story and the lessons she had learned along the way. The workshop was held at a community center, and when Sarah walked into the room filled with eager faces, she felt a wave of nervous energy. But as she stood in front of the crowd, her heart settled. The words she had written in her journal, the lessons she had learned in the village, all of it came rushing to her in a moment of clarity. She began to speak, not from a place of expertise, but from a place of honesty and vulnerability. She shared her journey, her struggles, and the breakthroughs she had experienced. She spoke about the power of letting go of fear, about embracing uncertainty, and about learning to trust oneself. The audience responded with rapt attention, hanging on to every word. As Sarah finished her talk, she felt a sense of fulfillment that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. For the first time, she understood that her story wasn't just her own. It could inspire others to find their own paths to healing and transformation. In the days that followed, Sarah began receiving messages from people who had attended the workshop. They shared how her story had resonated with them, how it had inspired them to take action in their own lives. Some wanted advice, others simply wanted to thank her for being open and real. This was the start of something new, something she had never considered before, a career in coaching, helping others navigate their own journeys of personal transformation. Sarah threw herself into this new venture with passion and dedication. She completed training in life coaching, attending seminars and workshops to deepen her understanding of the human psyche. She began working with clients, guiding them through their own journeys of self-discovery and growth. Slowly, but surely, her reputation grew, and she became known for her authenticity, her compassion, and her ability to help others tap into their own inner strength. Through this work, Sarah realized that she had found her true calling. It wasn't about a specific job or title. It was about being a guide, a mentor, and a source of support for those who were seeking their own transformation. Her past had led her to this point. and every step she had taken, every fear, every failure had brought her closer to her purpose. Point one evening, as Sarah sat in her office reflecting on the journey she had taken, she couldn't help but smile. She had come so far from the woman who had walked into the village searching for answers. Now, she was the woman who knew that the answers were always inside her, and that the most important part of the journey was not the destination, but the lessons learned along the way. The long, arduous journey of self-discovery had led her to this point, a place where everything seemed to fall into place and simultaneously unravel in the most unexpected of ways. Amid the confusion, she found clarity. The noise of the world around her faded, and what remained was the sharp focus on her dreams and ambitions. A life that had once seemed preordained was now in her own hands, ready to be sculpted by her own decisions. It had taken years to get here, years of patience, struggle, and overcoming obstacles that often seemed insurmountable. There had been moments when she questioned her path, moments when doubt crept in like a shadow that clouded her every step. But those moments, those hard-earned lessons, had been the very foundation on which she stood today. For the longest time, she had adhered to the conventional roles expected of her. Society, family, and even friends had shaped her decisions, telling her how to think, what to aspire to, and what success looked like. It was a life of predictability, but deep down, she knew it wasn't her life, not fully. It was a narrative that had been written for her, one she had merely followed. But now, the script was hers to rewrite. The transition from one chapter to another wasn't seamless. It was marked by periods of discomfort and uncertainty. The unknown seemed like a vast ocean, and every decision was like stepping into uncharted waters. She had left the comfort of familiar shores behind, trading security for a chance to create something truly her own. She had been afraid of the ocean, afraid of what lay beyond, but her heart beat with a deep desire to take the plunge. It was only in embracing the uncertainty that she began to feel a true sense of freedom. A freedom that was not about doing what others expected but about doing what she wanted, what aligned with her true self. Her aspirations shifted. No longer was she seeking approval or validation from those around her. She wasn't living for anyone else but herself. The early days of the transition had been lonely. There were no roadmaps, no guarantees that she was making the right choices. Every decision felt like an experiment, each one carrying its own set of risks. But as she moved forward, the fog began to lift. What once felt like aimlessness became a journey of purpose. The quiet moments of introspection revealed that what she had been chasing all along wasn't success in the conventional sense. It was fulfillment. The kind of fulfillment that came from authenticity, from pursuing a path that spoke to her heart. There were moments of triumph along the way. Small victories that acted as reminders that she was on the right track. Each accomplishment, no matter how small, was a testament to her resilience and determination. Yet, with every success came new challenges, new hurdles to jump over. But she was no longer afraid of them. Each challenge was an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to evolve. As she started to make her own decisions, she realized that she had the power to shape her own story. The limitations she once believed were placed on her by external forces were now gone, shattered by the realization that she was the architect of her destiny. She no longer needed validation from others to feel worthy. The most important validation came from within, knowing that she was living in alignment with her values, her goals, and her vision for the future. But change didn't come without sacrifices. She had to let go of the familiar, friendships, family expectations, and even the sense of safety that had once defined her existence. At times, the loneliness felt overwhelming, like an unyielding void that threatened to swallow her whole. The old world she had known seemed to recede, leaving her with a deep sense of alienation. But she soon learned that loneliness was not a sign of failure. It was a sign of transformation. To forge a new path, she had to let go of the old. It was the only way forward. The real breakthrough came when she started to trust herself completely. It wasn't about having all the answers or being perfect. It was about trusting the process, trusting her instincts, and allowing herself the grace to make mistakes. There would be failures, of course, but they were just stepping stones to success. Each misstep was a lesson in resilience, a reminder that growth didn't happen without discomfort. Her relationships with others began to shift, too. She attracted people who were aligned with her new vision, people who supported her journey without judgment or expectation. These were individuals who understood that the road to fulfillment was never linear. They knew that the struggles were part of the process, and they shared in her triumphs and setbacks without trying to impose their own agendas on her. Yet, despite all the changes, there was still a lingering sense of uncertainty. Could she truly forge her own path without looking back? Would the risks she had taken pay off in the long run? But for the first time in a long while, she realized that the answers didn't matter as much as the journey itself. She was learning to be okay with uncertainty, to embrace it as part of the process. The beauty of life wasn't in the destination. It was in the moments of transformation, the steps taken towards something new. The turning point came when she realized that she had come full circle, not just in her career, but in her understanding of herself. The person she had been at the start of her journey was no longer the same person standing at this new crossroads. She had grown, evolved, and become someone who could navigate the complexities of life with strength, grace, and authenticity. And so, she took the next step, not with the certainty that everything would be perfect, but with the courage to continue moving forward. The uncertainty of the future was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace, something to work with rather than against. The journey would continue, and every step would be one of growth, learning, and living fully. This was no longer just about her. It was about something larger, something greater than herself. She wasn't just creating a life. She was creating a legacy, one decision at a time. And as she moved forward, she knew that the story she was writing would be one that resonated with others. A story of resilience, of authenticity, and of the courage to forge a path in the face of uncertainty. And with that realization, she stepped into the future with newfound strength, ready for whatever it would bring. The air around her felt different now, lighter, more expansive, as though the weight she had carried for so long had finally been lifted. In those quiet moments of reflection, she realized just how far she had come. The woman she had been at the start of this journey was a far cry from the woman who now stood at the precipice of something new and beautiful. It wasn't just the physical distance she had traveled. It was the internal transformation that had reshaped her. She no longer sought approval from others or measured her worth by the expectations placed on her. She was living for herself, for her dreams, her desires, her truth. But even now, the world outside her was shifting. She could see how everything she had learned, the resilience, the courage, the lessons from her failures and triumphs, had brought her to this moment. And yet, the story was far from over. Her life had changed, but the work was never truly done. It was as though the closing of one chapter opened a new one, filled with endless possibilities and the unknown. The future, once a vast and intimidating expanse, now felt like a canvas waiting for her to paint with bold, fearless strokes. The uncertainty that had once paralyzed her was now the very thing that ignited her passion and curiosity. She took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh, crisp air as she watched the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with colors that seemed to mirror the colors of her journey. Every hue, a shade of red, orange, purple, felt like a reflection of the struggles she had overcome, the lessons she had learned, and the triumphs she had earned. The journey had not been easy, but it had been hers. She owned it completely, and that ownership brought with it a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. But there was one more thing she had to do before moving forward. One final step to fully release the chains that had once held her back. She had to forgive herself. Forgive herself for the doubts, the mistakes, the moments of self-criticism. She had been so hard on herself, so wrapped up in the pressures of perfection, that she had forgotten the most important lesson of all. There was no such thing as perfection. It was the flaws, the mistakes, the moments of vulnerability that made her human, that made her journey worthwhile. In embracing her imperfections, she had found her power. With the weight of that realization, she let go. She let go of the need to control every aspect of her life, to have all the answers, to meet the expectations of those around her. She let go of the fear of failure, knowing that it was not failure, but growth that defined her journey. And with that, she felt a freedom unlike any other. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the future, not of the unknown. She had embraced it all, the uncertainty, the vulnerability, the risks, and in doing so, had discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. And as she stood there, watching the final slivers of daylight fade into twilight, she knew that the future was hers to create. She would no longer be bound by the expectations or limitations of her past. She would carve her own path, knowing full well that it wouldn't always be easy. But the road ahead was hers to travel, and that knowledge, that sense of self, would carry her through the hardest of times. With renewed determination, she turned away from the horizon, ready to embrace whatever came next. The fears that had once seemed so overwhelming now felt small, almost insignificant. She had faced the hardest parts of her journey, the moments of doubt, the loneliness, the sacrifices, and had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more connected to her true self than ever before. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, of course. There would be obstacles, mistakes, and setbacks. But there would also be growth, adventure, and moments of sheer joy. She was ready to face it all, for she now understood that life wasn't about avoiding the struggles. It was about embracing them, learning from them, and continuing to move forward, no matter what. She had come full circle, and now, with the lessons of her past firmly in her heart, she stepped boldly into the future. Not as the person she once was, but as the person she had always been meant to be. And so, her journey continued.